Dr. Cheree Quizon, who is our speaker for today. She has been, we met at Euroseas with Kate, who is also here, and Emil, and Tasha, and Mylene when we were there in Berlin. So she, alongside Nina Baker, we were very fortunate to meet them. And through the next few years, so the past 2 years, I've been following her works in Mindanao. And I think currently you are, as you mentioned, you are currently in sabbatical, but you are associated with Seton Hall University in the US. So, and later I think there will be more catch-ups, but for now, let us all listen to Dr. Cheree Quizon's talk on Abaca.
Right. Thank you, Anna. Let me just share my screen. Oh, I also want to tell everybody, I'm not able to function presenting and also looking at the chat, so please don't be, if I don't respond to the chat, pasensya na kasi
No
hindi
worries.
ko magawa ng sabay-sabay.
JJ and I will be monitoring the chat, and then we will be, for the recording purposes, we will read it out loud as well for you.
Okay, thank you. So sorry, I'm going to launch this now. All right, I hope everybody can see the slide.
Yes.
It's up on the screen. Okay, thanks. So this talk, by the way, thank you so much for inviting me to the BINALOT talks. It's a pleasure to be able to attend kahit na hating gabi dito. I'm very pleased that I'm able to do this. This talk occurs after a couple that I made in February. And so some of you, I think Anna, you were there for those, right? They're recorded. One was for Cornell, the Southeast Asia program called Bloody Reds. And the other one was for Bard Graduate Center called Going Bananas. So if any of you wish to look those up, they're both online. I did give those two talks too. And some of those topics I kind of went into in greater detail, right, in those two of those talks. So the Bloody Reds talk was about morinda, which is the dye plant for red, and the Going Bananas talk was focused on fiber. But today, based on my conversations with Anna, sabi ko pagsasamahin natin, no, so that I can talk about, I guess, trying to understand what about the ethnographic perspectives on Abaca Ikat cloth, my work in Mindanao, could be of use, right, to archaeologists. And so I thought I would think about it as, the tangible and the intangible. So let me just get into the talk right now. So I have like the purpose and flow, right? So I'll try to situate Abaca Ikat textile production in Mindanao by presenting the results of a survey I did in 1992-94, when I was still a graduate student, trying to understand how I want to approach Bagobo cloth. So I knew I was going to study Bagobo cloth, but I also wanted to understand the state of the field. So I did a survey of all groups that were producing Abaca Ikat textile in Mindanao in 1994. And when I returned in 97, I focused on the Bagobo. The snapshot that I'm going to show you would be some of the information, right, that I learned both from the ethnographic perspective as well as museum collections research. And so the arrow I have there kind of shows you that the way I use the museum collections and ethnography is actually that they relate to each other. So it's not just I go to museums and I go to ethnography. I actually use a museum collection images for elicitation, right? So it's kind of like a back and forth process. It's also worth noting that when I did go back in 1987, I worked primarily with the Tagabawa and Jangan Bacobo. Right? And there are reasons for why this was the case, but those were the two groups that I worked with primarily. So the data that I'm going to present would be focusing on banana fiber cloth making, right? Fiber looming design. It's just going to be a snapshot. I can't present all of it, but that would be the tangible, right? And I'm going to try to then bring it into what I call the intangible, right? So it's an attempt essentially, right, to present, what historians call history from below, right? So the voice of folks who are underrepresented in our understanding, right, of I guess our textile heritage, in this case, indigenous peoples, but even more importantly, how they today, understand this cloth that we consider to be so valuable, right, in the wider sphere. So I wanted to be able to bring that out. Right? So the intangible is actually trying my best, as approximate as much as possible, perspectives nila from below, which is of course, can be problematic. So it's just an attempt that I'm trying to do, to try to kind of sketch those out. And I will focus also on the notion of semantic categories of Abaca Ikat cloth. What I've learned in my field work, that it's possible to conduct research concerning these things, even if the cloth itself is not physically present. So it's like an interpretive challenge, but I've learned that much, that hindi kailangan nandun yung tela for the tela to be understood or for us to have a conversation about cloth. And if there's time, there's a couple of comments I want to make on recent work, implications of my work concerning recent work. I just list down a bunch of things that I've published over the years, from which I draw some of the material I produce. I'm presenting today, and I'm also, of course, revisiting them as well. But those are just the stuff that I've done in the past. Okay, so by the way, in my purpose and presentation, I've numbered everything, so you can see that there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my slides are also numbered. So I'll have situation slides, and I'll have ethnography and museum slides, etc. So that's what those numbers are for. So this is about the distribution of loom move and Abaca fiber. So in approaching Mindanao Abaca Ikat, I wanted to actually ask, in a broader sense, is there any Abaca or banana, right, musa fiber Ikat production outside of Mindanao? The answer would be yes. So the first question would be musa and Ikat. So banana, Abaca, right? In the Philippines, musa textiles or Ikat. So the only two places that exists, as far as we know, would be the Philippines, which in this case I highlight southern Mindanao, right, as well as the Ryukyu Islands in Japan. And then within the Mindanao context, right, I had a sampling frame just focusing on this combination of Abaca and Ikat that I did in the field, which was in that area shown there, which is essentially southern and eastern Mindanao, right? There's a likely broader distribution based on the Banton cloth, right, which Vic was saying that I talked about long ago, right, in a paper I gave with I had to work on with Judith Cameron. Matagal na yun. I haven't gone back to that, but there's certainly a very important, I think, technical continuities that I observed, but that's just as far as observation is concerned. Banana that doesn't use Ikat, however, is also widespread. So you would have it in Sangihitalaon Islands, right, the work of Petra Martin, as well as in the Caroline and Yap Islands, eastern, right, the eastern, Western Pacific. So in that case, they have banana, pero walang Ikat. So that's an important difference. So the patterning is using supplementary weft. And of course, there's plain weave Abaca, which is all over the Philippines, right, such as Sinamay, right? So it's a very common cloth and common fiber and I'm focusing it as loom woven. I'm aware of certain works that don't look at loom woven stuff. For example, the work of Celine Kerfant with Taiwan, the Taiwanese kind of baskets. I don't look into that. I look into loom woven stuff and backstrap loom, right? That is consistent with the use of Abaca. So these are the areas that I've looked at. There is some floor loom use also in Okinawa and some floor loom use in other parts of the Philippines, but in Mindanao it's all backstrap loom. Okay. Essentially, there are two types. So the Mandaya one seems to be one type, and then you have the rest of southern Mindanao having the other type of loom. So the banana species that we're talking about that has Ikat, right, would be, of course, yung sa atin, sa Abaca, musa textiles. So these are slides from my prior talk on growing bananas. So I just used images from the Q site. So on the left, you see, right, that it's endemic, right? Abaca, it's endemic. It's been introduced more broadly. And so, like I said in my prior talk, Q has a very conservative way of determining introduction. So you might actually find maps out there that might have more, right, that show the introduction of Abaca. And on the right, it's an image of the map for Musa balbisiana, which is the variety in Ryukyu Islands. But you see here also showing as being native, where it's native and where it's been introduced. Right? So it's a different distribution. No? There are many, many kinds of banana species, but I've only focused on Abaca, and then I kind of went into comparative research a little bit in the Okinawan stuff because of my interest in Ikat. And the reason why I did this is because I have to kind of focus on something. I wanted to see, given this question, what can we learn? Because there are certain technical features that doing Ikat, right, makes it really, really distinct from non-Ikat textiles, right? And also the use of Abaca, right? So Abaca or banana, the way the thread is prepared is very, very distinct from the way, let's say, cotton is prepared. So because of that, I believe that this is a very important technical question that I really kind of have to pursue. No, so for example, silk would be one of those that are like that. It's unspun, right? However, silk doesn't have a lot of knotting because it's quite a continuous fiber in most cases. There are many other fibers that are not spun. But for loom woven, no? So for example, there's agave in Okinawa, right? There's a whole bunch of them. No? Pero sa Mindanao, it's essentially Abaca. So I'm going to go with that and pursue that and see where it takes me. So common names, right? Abaca all over the Philippines, Bo'o, Tagabao, Bagogo, Lutay, and Cebuano, right? Manilhem, Kanyamo, right? So common names also in Yayama Island, Tito Basho, Basha. So marami siyang mga local names, which is also important for us to note as much as possible, because sometimes we think it's banana or we think it's that, but it actually can be something else. No? So Manila hemp, for example, has for the longest time given the wrong impression that it's actually a hemp instead of being a banana, and so on and so forth. But the common names are important because they also tend to be names used in ship manifests, no, in trade, etc. So for purposes of trying to kind of track it down, the common names are important. So the banana, there are other banana studies I look at, no, I won't go into it here. But for example, I just recently learned, of course, this might be old news for others, right? That from the old morphological approaches to banana, there's now DNA approaches instead, right? But it's a well-established cultivar. It's the changes that are in it we assume to be desired by humans, no? But whether humans are the only ones spreading it, we don't know. Some have said maybe it's also through bats, no? So there are many kinds of interesting questions about the desirable qualities and the spread of banana. But there's some interesting plant from morphology studies in Mindanao. And then of course, this whole new plant DNA that separates Musa textilis from Musa balbisiana, which is interesting, right? What that means, I don't know yet, but I think that's interesting. So recall, balbisiana is the Okinawan one and textilis is the one that we have in Mindanao. And then of course, lots of archaeological research. So yung ethnoarchaeology, as a Interfant, I'm reading her dissertation, right? in Taiwan and Batanes. And then she clued me into the Leang Saru site in Sangin Talao that talks about phytoliths, banana phytoliths, right? And I look into ethnographic and historical research, right? In Okinawa because of my interest, right, in this Abaca Ikat or banana plus Ikat thing. So other stuff I'm reading, right? So the interesting Abaca morphology that they're just looking at, you know, out of 110 varieties, there are like 10 possible ones that would say cluster around. It's a component analysis kind of approach. And these are images, right, from Fuentes' study that look at some of the Musa phytoliths as well as fiber that they found in the Sapo site. So very interesting stuff. But you know, I'm reading that. I'm trying to understand as much as I can. But the stuff that I did make use of, right, would be, of course, ethnographic research, right? So for the ethnographic component of my research, right, I did the survey in 1994. And here I have images from the field, right, from that particular period, the early period. So counterclockwise, right, Salintamo, who many of you might know as the Gawad Manilikan Bayan, the late Salintamo, was my principal informant in 1994 in Bansalan, right? This was in the Makilala area with Giselle Barreto and Molino Ogit. This was in Malungon, in Sarangani, and this was in Lamiawan. So it was like that was the survey, right? That I was basically doing snowball sampling, but using also photographic images to kind of determine who is able to take me to someone who is knowledgeable about Ikat, right? And this is kind of some of the research I found in the early phase, right? And then in 1997 phase, then I focused more on more of Davao del Sur with some comparative sites in Sibulan, right, which is in Davao City, as well as Kalinan and Talomo, also in Davao City for the Jangan areas. And then there were some more in Makilala as well, and Malasila for Obo, some Obo, but mostly also Davao Pagobo. And then some Blaan, as you said, Malungon areas, as well as Matanao. So this shows you like a schematic map, right, of those areas that I studied and that I visited in that initial survey. And I present here an interesting thing that I want everyone to kind of think about, right? And the first thing is that when you think of the regions of heritage use, we know that this area is in black, so Zamboanga, Misamis, Western Mindanao, Agusan region, East Central Mindanao, coastal Southern Mindanao, Western Davao, it is the black ones, no? Those are areas where one might go and one might not find Abaca Ikat anymore, or one might find it, right? However, in those areas of heritage use or heritage awareness, right, there is actually an important semantic category that still exists, right? When I would interview people, right? So there was a recognition of Abaca Ikat as a special prestige category. In the red areas, this pertain to the areas that I did visit where there was observable weaving production. Right? And so I wasn't able to go to the Zamboanga Misamis area, well, partly because it was a budget issue, right? And I'm hoping somebody will to do some more work on the Subanon. Some stuff has come out on the Subanon because they do have Abaca Ikat. Other areas that have Ikat would, of course, be the Muslim groups, right? Maranao, Maguindanao, but they don't necessarily have Abaca Ikat, right? At least in contemporary times. Right? There's evidence that there's Abaca use in the early 20th century, for example, but I have not yet encountered Abaca Ikat use among them. It might be there, but I haven't found it. Okay, so then the other component of the methodology is museum and archival research. So here I just show you some images, right? So on the left, it's the Metcalf collection, 1906 to 1910, right, of Pagobo cloth. And on the right, it's a later piece from the Slocum collection in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, right? It's Mandaya. So this is the kind of stuff that I would visit, right? And then so I basically focus on works that, collections that have very good provenance for me to actually consider them, right, as part of my kind of, you might say, baseline, right, and see when those pieces were actually accumulated. So that's just a detailed view of that piece on the left. So you can see some of the inked numbers that the Metcalf sisters actually put on it, and you see the detail, right, of the Ikat. And here on the right, you have, these are like the newer images I've taken, which are more like microscope images that show you, right, the warp versus weft kind of character of Mandaya Dagmay. So it tells us so much about who made them, primarily because there is actually a very distinct stylistic approach of the Mandaya that do not polish their cloth, as opposed to, let's say, the Tiboli Blaan and the Bagobo, who do polish their cloth. So you can actually see it in the scope images, and this is unpolished cloth. At any rate, so when I combine the field and museum data, right, I also incorporated Bagobo family collection. So on the leftmost, you see here a 3-panel skirt, a Ginayan Kinaino with crocodile ikat motif, right, in the collection of the Pagobo family in 1994 that includes her upper garments there. So this is something that I found in families' possessions that I asked to photograph, and then I left them behind. You know, I basically just want to photograph them, and I don't really want to do any more with them because I didn't really wish to be part of the whole antiquarian exploitation, you might say, right, of private family collections of Pagobo. So I just took pictures and gave them copies of the pictures I took, like, and it's on my way. The middle part is an example of, right, a museum piece of the Dagmay 1920s, right, the Slocum collection, and the right, contemporary production. So these are kind of the things that I would look at, right, and you would see that there's really a great deal of stability in some cases, right, that I observed, and then also some very interesting points of innovation. I'm going to go through these following slides rather quickly because I have a bunch of them. And this is the other set of information that I found, like my tangible findings, right, which would be major plants, right? So bo'o, right, I use here Pagobo terms, right? So it's Musa textiles, so that's found everywhere, right, in the areas that I've studied. The loom lumber comes from Pola, Cariota Rubiana, right? So I found that everywhere. So the Visayan names is, you could also find that. So they call it Bahi in Cebuano, right? Or Basag, right? It's everywhere. So that was kind of consistent. Morinda for red, right? So that's Sikarig in Tagabao Bagobo with various local names. And then Kinarim, which is a Tagabao term, right, for the source of black. So red and black are important type plants. Again, that's shared across all the groups. What's distinct, though, is that the Mandaya are known to, or have reported to me, the use of ferruginous mud, right, iron-rich mud for their source of black, which I have not observed, right, but it was reported to me. So it's very interesting, right, that they indicate that as an alternative source of black, right, which other groups have not reported. So that's very interesting. Some minor plants, right? These are colorants, kalawag, which is the right curcuma longa, daluga, which is an introduction, right, from Spain, right? So, but it's been taken up, right, as a minor colorant. And some other minor plants used for mordants, right? So wood ash from right, Ficus minahasa, right, Spatulobus, etc., right? As well as some ferns, and then a few others that are used for ritual post-dyeing, as well as packaging, right? So it's a really kind of, you know, it's interesting that perhaps what differs is that the mordants reported to me, let's say among the Mandaya, might not be completely the same as the mordants reported among the Blaan and the Pagobo and Boli, but you know, generally, right, when you think about it, it's essentially Morinda citrifolia. For the source of red, for example, and the source of black. So the insights, of course, would be right that, and it's not a minor insight, by the way. When I started this work in 1993, nobody could answer this question for me. So it was not a minor thing to be able to come to this conclusion that the Bagobo Tagabawa would have such terms, Jangan have such terms, Blaan, Tiboli, and Mandaya would have such terms, right? And that essentially that this is actually shared, right? So this is kind of like, I kid you not, this was like there was no way for me to determine this before I did the survey. Another thing I could say what would be then would be the intangibles, right? So the dyeing things in red. So in the left, I have two images here that use the dyeing using Sicari Grutambunan citrifolia. And I say Bagobo because these are the terms that the Bagobo use, right? And you will have Salintamon on there as well as Doricel Nakano Bangkas, right? Who was my research assistant, right? And she was engaged in dyeing of red. On the right, I have a photo that I reproduced from Norman Respicious' book. That was taken by Assistant Pikachu, which shows Langdulay, right, the other kawat ng mga lilahan ng bayan, engaged in dyeing of black, right? So, which in the Tiboli, it's called Knalum, right? So these, I put this under my kind of insights, I guess, into the intangible, because what we find is that, right, and I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, right, is that dyeing itself, right, is part of a larger hierarchy of tasks and a larger hierarchy of knowledge. And that red as a color is of a higher position, or so more prestigious and more, it's a more important color, right, than black. And I spoke about this in my Bloody Red talk a little bit more when I discussed Morinda. But generally, right, these are kind of consistent throughout the various groups. And so this hierarchy of red over black, right, and I show you here an early 20th century piece, right, of a bagobo upper garment, which we don't necessarily find anymore today, because nowadays the garments tend to be made, right, of commercial cloth, right? But you have this kind of approach, right, when you have Abaca that has this dual color, right? And the achieving red is much more difficult than trying to achieve black. By the way, here is the view of the Merinda citrifolia root, right, which has been peeled and then scraped, right? I think in other parts of Southeast Asia, they say it's powdered. I think in Rote, in just off Timor, it's supposed to be powdered, but it's all over Southeast Asia, and it's used also on cotton in the rest of Southeast Asia. However, in Mindanao, it's used on Abaca. And then Diospyros nitida, which is the source for black. In Mindanao, the leaves are used, and it is a much less difficult color to achieve. And it's, as far as I can tell, there is no reports of the use of Diospyros nitida anywhere. The only thing I've encountered would be a report of the use of it in mainland Southeast Asia, but there was report with the use of the berries, but it was very sketchy. So in mainland Southeast Asia, I haven't encountered the use of Diospyros nitida, right, for black. So, and here is, I kind of expanded this a little bit based on my last talk, right? So within the task hierarchy of creating cloth, and I'm using here Bagoba terminology, right? Tagabaw Bagoba terminology. There is a task hierarchy, right? Wherein, and so let me just go through this table with everybody, right? So these are the cloth making tasks, right? So stripping, hagut in Tagabawa, right? Weaving, gabal, ikat tying or design, badbad, right? Dyeing itself, liba, right? With black, metum, or dyeing, liba with red, malotop. These are all Tagabawa terms, right? And so on the next column, I kind of map the skill level associated with each one. So stripping Abaca fiber is a low skill. It can be done by the weaver. It can be done by weavers' relatives, right? Sometimes men, usually men, but if there are no men around, even the old women can do it, right? They don't want to, but they can, right? Duration would be as needed, right? For weaving, the duration would be about 2 to 4 months continuous work. Tying a design needs medium to high skill. So simple designs, medium skill, high, more complex designs, which in the Ikat world means wider designs, right? Take longer. So it's about a month per loom length of cloth for continuous work, right? Dyeing with black, high skill, 3 to 7 days continuous work, and dyeing with red, very high skill, 14 plus days continuous work. And the reason why I bring this chart is to show that the most difficult tasks aren't necessarily the ones that take up the most time, right? So weaving itself, right, takes a very long time, but it's not considered the highest skill work. So it's important to kind of be aware of this kind of task hierarchy. And this shared task hierarchy, again, can be found right all over Southeast Asia, where Ikat takes place. The difference would be where the black and the red is mapped, because elsewhere in Southeast Asia, for example, among the Iban, right, of Borneo and Kalimantan, black is not derived from Diospyros nitida, but it's derived from indigo. And so in that sense, it's indigo on cotton, which is what we also find in northern Luzon. And so it's actually a very difficult color to achieve compared to the black of Mindanao on Abaca, right? And so I'm suggesting here that the shared task hierarchy and the perception, right, of difficulty that exists in Mindanao and the associations with the meanings of color is mapped into this notion of effort, right? Effort and knowledge. And so in the sense that the meaning of color would vary because of how difficult it is to achieve color, the kind of knowledge you would need to be able to achieve a certain color. And so the Morinda, right, in Mindanao would be the most fraught, right, because of what it requires, like more than immersion, boiling, post-additives, ritual interventions, and so on and so forth, right? And like I said, it's consistent, not just in Borneo, Kalimantan, but it's also in Sumba, right, the work of Janet Hoskins, right, and among others. Then the next set of insights into the intangible, I call it, right, would be also what I've learned in the field concerning what it means to be a Bagobo, to self-identify as a Bagobo, right? So what I have here would be two maps, one from Hayase and one from Elkins, right, which talk about the Bagobo languages, right? And so if you look at the left-hand image, which is Hayase's map, he was mapping Bagobo languages spoken within Davao City. And what we see here would be that here is Mount Alomo and Mount Apo, right? And you have Tagabao Bagobo areas here, south, west, right, of Mount Apo. Then you would have Obo Bagobo areas here, right, which is on the other side of the mountain, right? And we have Jangan Klata, right, settlements, right, over here, right? Which is consistent with my own research as well. Hayase did field research, even though Hayase is a historian, right? And so the work he did is consistent with my field research, which shows that the Bagobo who self-identify as Bagobo belong to actually three groups, right? They call themselves Tagabao Bagobo, so it's a hyphenated identity, right? And for the linguistic classification of the Bagobo, using Elkins, right? Here I want to focus, right? Here's the Tagabawa and here's the Obo, right? Using the linguistic classification, we find that Elkins shows, right, that two of these languages, right, which belong to the Manobo group of languages, are actually not from the same branch. Right? So it's very interesting to me to discover that you have a group that self-identifies Bagobo, but linguistically, right, two of them diverge. The Jangan branch is even more divergent linguistically. It's not even a Manobo, but it's a Bilik language, right? But these are the groups that self-identify as Bagobo who share this material culture of textile, right? So this is one of the things that I learned in the field. Suggested, right, in various field research in the past, for example, Manuel's work, you would call it Manuvu, right? But it's been demonstrated that he was actually working with Obo, right? But on the other side, right, of the mountain. And so, and sometimes the Obo will self-identify as Manobo. So there's a certain kind of interesting kind of slippage there as to how people will self-identify. Sorry, what is this? Oh, sorry. Okay. And so this also kind of shows, I'm using glottolog here just to show you where those three groups that self-identify as Bagobo actually belong linguistically, right? So the Tagabawa here, as you can see, is in the South Manobo group. The Obo Manobo is in the West. Obo Manobo is essentially what is also Obo, right? And the Jangan in the Bilik group. Right? So these are kind of like kind of surprising insights. And I learned this only because when I decided that I was going to go focus on the Bagobo, I had to actually choose a field language. And I had to choose Tagabao Bagobo because it was consistent with the research that was done with the museum collections I was looking at in the early 20th century, as well as the late 19th century, which was essentially all on Tagabao Bagobo and Tagabao Bagobo areas, which is, again, very interesting, right? So another thing that then brings me to ask myself, right, you know, so there's a Bagobo in the 1880s, Bagobo museum collections, right, in the 1880s, 1900s, right? Bagobo and Anthropological and Historical Fieldwork, right? This is Manuel Payne Rodil, Hayasi Gloria, right? Elkins and Dubois. Bible translation work, right? That actually specify, right? These Bagobo, that I kind of acknowledge this kind of tripartite identity of having linguistic subgroups within them. And so, which is consistent with my field work. And so I see that there's a shared textile material culture contiguous with territory, but not language, right? So it's very, very interesting. A part of that, Hayase is right, a part of that seems to be determined by the notion of marriage, preferred marriage partners, right? So he has presented some genealogical data, and I am looking at my own. I have about 79 genealogies that I'm kind of reinvestigating, right? Which kind of shows how most Bagobo who self-identify as Bagobo actually tend to self-identify as belonging to the group where they are co-resident. But if you actually ask them a little bit more, it's quite likely that one of the marital partners actually comes, let's say, they live in the Tagabawa area, they'll call themselves Tagabawa and learn Tagabawa, but you'll find out that one of the marriage partners is actually Obo, for example, or Jangan, right? So unless you ask, it's not going to be kind of evident. So it's important to also find out where they were born, right? And among other things, to actually specifically ask also the languages that they spoke as children. So this is the slide that you all saw earlier, right? And I wanted to just kind of bring it back to this one. So one of the insights that I've also kind of learned would be that when we try to do textile research the way I have done, and we find in the field that there might not be textiles present, that it doesn't necessarily mean that there is no knowledge of textiles in that area, right? And so that's what I call the semantic category, right? So the semantic category of prestige cloth, which is Abaca plus Ikat, is actually all over Mindanao, right? And so it is usually among the old people, but for young people, it's the ones who happen to actually engage with older people. Usually I've observed among the Bagobo, it would be the individuals who participate in performance, right? So interested in Bagobo music and Bagobo, let's say, dance, right? And then what happens is that there's a transfer of both the textiles that are given to them by their grandparents, right, or their parents, as well as the associated knowledge with it. So there's an interesting kind of way by which some young people who are more knowledgeable tend to be the ones closer to their grandparents or their parents, but who also are interested in such associated activities that require the wearing of dress. But the semantic category exists even if the cloth is no longer there. And the cloth tends to not be there for various reasons, but usually it's when they're not well enough, they're not well off, they're poor, then it tends to get pawned, right, or sold. And so there's an interesting kind of correlation between, right, economic hardship, right, and the ability to hang on to family collections of cloth. Observable heritage use or ownership, right, in this entire map, right, it's some, right, only some would have it, again, for those reasons, right, whether they're able to hang on to them or not. And then the observable weaving would be in the red areas, right, which is actually fewer. What I want to kind of point out, though, is that based on all of this, there is a tangible and intangible Mindanao textile knowledge system, right, that is not visible to us if we coming just from the outside, because we tend to just look for cloth, whether it's there or not there, and knowledge of the making of the cloth. So even if the folks who make it are not able to make it anymore, right? So or those who never made it, actually. So there's a certain kind of maturity in the textile production, especially among the Jangan. I've discovered this among the Jangan, wherein Jangan women don't necessarily make the cloth or don't necessarily do the ikating, but they actually purchase ikated thread from other women and then weave. So this interesting kind of maturity in some cases, right? Especially for the areas that have had a great deal of cash in cash economy, where you have this kind of you might say multi-centered production, right? Textile production. So it's never just one person. And this is even more consistent with, let's say, when they become turned into garments, right? So it's never just one woman who engages in the making of that, but it actually gets passed, down from one to the next, especially if there's going to be additional, um, um, uh, you might say, additional treatments, right, that have to happen to the textile for it to be considered finished, right? So, but there's certainly that. So there's the tangible and intangible kind of textile system that exists, right? Okay, so I don't know. I guess there's time to do this. I just wanted to comment on a couple of works of interest. I know that many of us are reading or have read that report on multiple migrations by Lorena and others. And so the only thing I wanted to say about that was that I've noticed that the way they've categorized the populations have been actually to use linguistic groupings. And I feel that based on what I understand from just the Bagobo arc, right, between the late 19th to the late 20th century, that perhaps linguistic categories might not necessarily be a stable category, right? Because of the degree of intermarriage, as well as the distinction between identity and self-ascription and actual genetic, right? Genetic patterns, right? The second thing would be this work that by Buckley, whether or not I agree with Buckley in his approach using like phylogenetic analysis for textiles. What I find interesting in his work is that his attempt to try to take apart Ikat motifs. And I have here an image of how he's kind of like putting them into specific categories. And I find this interesting because in my own field research, weavers are not really interested in talking about motifs. They get very bored when I start asking them about motifs. They don't want to tell you about crocodiles and stuff. They'll tell me stuff, but it's kind of like because they're being patient with me. What they're interested in is actually counts, right? Weave counts, 10 count, 20 count, 30 count, 100 count, right? And I find that consistent with what Buckley's trying to do, wherein the important category of for Ikat producing individuals is really, right, numbers, right? And so I thought that was very interesting. But anyway, so that's my last slide. And I think so I'm done with that. So I am open for questions and comments from everyone.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cheree. For everyone else, you can ask questions by putting it on chat, or you can also raise your hand. You can click the reactions button below, and you can also put raise your hand. Or alternatively, you can also direct message either me or JJ if you want to. If you're shy but you have questions and you want to ask questions. So we will start out with some discussion. But again, thank you for that talk. There's a question. I also have some question, but we will let Dr. Victor ask.
Thank you again, Cheree, for as always a interesting talk, and so many things I want to ask, but I'll reserve it because I'm sure others have questions to ask. But just for starters, how is the transmission of knowledge in your observation of weaving, the skill, everything about it? Is it like like a what do you call this, a apprentice master relationship, or is just simply basta observe, no? And whoever is good will carry on. No? Is there such a thing as a apprentice master relationship, or just more informal?
Looking back, when I did my field work in 1993, 94, that was 1997, no? I learned in hindsight that they were actually times of great disruption for them because of the, they call it samok-samok, no? So CPP, NPA, right, military, it was very, very disruptive for them. So with looking back, I realized I was very lucky that I was even able to do what I had to do, no, during that time. So I cannot say that what I have observed, right, would be, right, times of peace. But for sure, they've said to me what it was like to be in the times of war, no? So pag may namatay, they cannot work, no, because it's so painful, no. When during World War II, when they would have evacuation bakwit, no, the looms would get right, rolled up and shoved somewhere, or they would move around. So you cannot weave if it's not right, if it's not the time of peace. So that was, or at least the time that they could actually kind of be able to concentrate. The other observation I must say is that Salinta Monon and Langdulay became Gawad Manilikha ng Bayan awardees. And so they were given salaries for life by the Philippine government through NCCA to teach, right? So, and those two women actually are examples of contrasting models of how they passed on their knowledge. And I've talked about this in a prior conference paper, that in Salinta's case, she spent most of the first few years of her award sorting out her family's economic issues, right? And meanwhile, in Langdulay's case, she didn't have similar economic issues. So she basically jumped right in and kind of, right, was able to do it. And when she did it, it was basically done through kin networks, right? So co-resident women, right, who came in, and she made it like but it was not traditional, quote unquote, anymore. She basically built an atelier, right, where the co-resident women were there, which makes perfect sense because it's basically craft work at home. No? In Salinta's case, it was after she solved the economic problems of her family, then she kind of got going. She was assisted by her sister. No? So again, these are like times of challenge, like for them.
But in their life story, Cheree, what did they what did they tell you? How did they learn it? Did they learn it via their mothers, or
yes,
or so kinship?
So for Salinta and for Langdulay, it was their mothers, right? So they usually are at the range of 12, 13, right? Around the age of puberty when they actually begin to learn. They actually help out because I remember that chart I had for the skill sets. So you help out in the low skill things, right? So everybody can do the. I didn't put in one of the skills, which was also to thread, right? To connect thread. So you help out prior to that, but usually the weaving happens around 12, 11, right? And then the dyeing happens much later. So for example, one of the women I was working with told me that it was one of those areas that really suffered a lot with the samok-samok. And she said to me, oh, recently I was invited to one of the older women that I met. Sabi niya, inimbita kami na pwede daw mag-dye ulit. Pero dahil beginner pa lang ako, itim muna. So, you know, and she was already like a mother of 3, right? So it was like in the age of 30, 40, 50. So talagang parang it's a big stage. However, yes, it would most likely, it's mostly kin networks, and it's mostly women's work. No? However, the labor you need to be able to gather and prepare the fiber, kailangan mo din ng kin networks na kasama mga lalaki. So the labor is really, you know, pamangkin, anak na lalaki, right? Apo, ganun ang ginagawa nila. So, and even in the more kind of, you know, state mediated ones like Salinta and Langdulay, definitely kin ang ginagamit nila.
I have other questions, but let others ask questions first.
Yes, I believe, oh yeah, we have a question here in the chat from Jack Medrana, and he asked, do the Bagobos wash their textiles? And then sort of a follow-up question to that. If yes, how do they do it without washing away the dyes? And that may also apply to other ethnic groups.
They all wash them, but they don't soak them, right? So, and the washing happens actually at the point of after you dye, you wash. No? So parang it's in the process of dyeing it. pag tapos na siya, so as far as the bagobo is concerned, when it's a finished cloth, and for bagobo, a finished cloth means it becomes a garment, no? Which is very different from, let's say, when you go and buy tinalak, let's say, tiboli cloth in the tourist shop, it's a roll, a loom length roll. For bagobo, hindi tapos yun, no? So for them, it's tapos na pag garment na siya. So once it's a finished garment and it's an Abaca ikat, it doesn't really get washed. It gets dry cleaned. So the dry cleaning is with the wax, the sizing, no? So they have a frame, a tension frame, where you have that's parang tension frame on the roof beam of a house. Tapos a smooth surface. It's usually a shell, but the bagobo also use something that they call filigrama, which is like the glass insulators for the electric supply, which is used to basically flatten the fiber and sized with wax. So under microscopic, kahit na hindi nga microscopic, tingnan mo lang, but under the microscope it's very, very clear, no? That older bagobo textiles, as Blaan also do this, no? Are polished. The Mandaya do not polish. But yeah, kung labhan man siya, hindi siya nilalabhan ng sabon, no? Dry clean. And for the Mandaya who do not polish, right? They're actually fast, as in color fast shots, as in you can rinse it, no, kung kailangan. But that's the whole point of the dye. It has to be color fast. Kaya hindi maganda yung hindi morinda or hindi Diospyros nitida. Those other colors are not fast, but morinda and Diospyros are fast. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yes. He thanks you for your answer, because yeah, he sort of talks about how, you know, in Asian textiles usually that's a difficulty when it comes to in discerning, you know, the washing or, you know, the issue with the dyes and the cloths. And
yeah, the fastness is if it's not fast, then you didn't succeed.
Yes.
I think Sir Vic also has something to add. Oh, please unmute. Sorry, Sir Vic. Sir Vic,
you're muted again.
Unmuted.
No, it's I have another question, but concerning Jack's question, it's the sweat. You know, can you imagine? You have to wash it, even if it's just a ceremonial kind of wearing. No, parang barong di ba? You have to wash it, but like you said, you just wash it, dry cleaning kinda. But Cheree, I was fascinated by your maps and the patterns that you were showing, where the ikat, or at least textiles made out of musa, seem to be limited, no, in island Southeast Asia and maybe southern the Japanese archipelago and the Pacific. My question, there are two a comment in a question. Could it be now that I don't know if it's still true, but as far as I know, the musa, as bananas domesticated, seem to have been domesticated in Mindanao, you know, down to Sulawesi, down to New Guinea. So you don't know of any musa textile in New Guinea or Sulawesi? You haven't encountered any, no? So yeah, I'm sorry. If none, let's say, or maybe, but then there's the question of your concept, which is also interesting, and I agree that you don't have to have the textile anymore, but you can still have the consciousness in the culture, which again means it will be harder to just to tease out in the literature, and but if not, for example, it really comes out that you don't see it in New Guinea, and then you don't see it in Sulawesi, and not in the Sulu archipelago, like the Bajaus, or you don't see it in any of the ethno-linguistic groups in the Sulu archipelago. Then for me, that tells me, gives us a narrow time depth for a narrow but still old time depth for and localized for this textile. So it is in Mindanao because early on, it has all the Musa speciation flourish well in that island, and then the cultures that formed in the island invented this kind of textile. That could be the answer, or like I said, maybe we are not just seeing it anymore, or maybe it is there but not recorded yet. No, in the so that would be a nice one, interesting to test. No? If the New Guinea groups and Sulawesi groups, if really there's no consciousness of this kind of textile in their cultures.
If you know, that's really kind of one of the really big questions I have, right? So if we rule out Abaca, right, just take out the fiber and just look at warp Ikat, then Mindanao warp Ikat is consistent with all the warp Ikat you find all over island Southeast Asia. Right? It's visually consistent. It's red and black, except the black they have is indigo, no?
Yeah.
But the red is morinda. And then the patterning, no, talagang it belongs, no? And then beyond island eastern Indonesia, right? Like for example, there is not a lot of Ikat in Sulawesi, right? Today anyway. There's a little bit, but not a lot. There's some in Toraja, no? Pero much of the ones that are really consistent would be in eastern Indonesia, as well as northern Kalimantan, Borneo, no, the Iban. And also this small group Kalimantan.
So it's in Toraja. So that's good. If it's in Toraja, then
yes, as Ikat, no, as Ikat. So if you look at it, it's actually all over. But then, so when you bring in the fiber, then right, the map changes. Then it's just Mindanao, and then right, Tukyu Islands, right? And then if you just do Abaca lang, no, then it's really broad, no. then it includes right all the way to Yap, Carolines. I'm sure it's beyond. Papua New Guinea is interesting because I haven't looms. The looms are the issue, no. So I'm not sure what the situation is for loom woven cloth are in Papua New Guinea, because it's also the dispersal of the backstrap loom. No?
Correct.
So the backstrap loom is what you find in all of these areas that do the warp Ikat. No? So that's kind of really interesting. No? So for me, like I'm trying to understand ano yung diferensya, no, ng bakit kamukha ng diba, that the Mindanao stuff looks so much like all this stuff in the rest of island Southeast Asia, but right, it's a completely different fiber. Now, from the point of view of ethnography, what I've also learned is that weavers care a lot about the ease with which they get their thread, no? And so in Mindanao, cotton thread is expensive, and Abaca will never be as expensive. So, kumbaga, dahil it's abundant and it's cheap, right? Because they just basically take it and prepare it and all that. Compared to cotton, which they have to buy, no? And they don't grow cotton, at least as far as my ethnographic research is concerned. No? Now, in other parts that you mentioned Sulu, no? For highly trade active areas such as the Sulu, right, Sultanate, I imagine cotton thread would be easier to get because it's also very much a cash-based economy. No? But for areas that are not so cash-based, mas mahirap kumuha, di ba, ng cotton thread. Not to mention it will also change the chemistry, of achieving the color. So I think that there might also be that, no, in terms of how it affects, right, how weavers think about thread. So malakas ang hila ng Abaca kasi madaling, di ba, madaling hindi mo kailangan bilhin yung thread, no? As opposed to cotton in elsewhere. So yeah, as far as I can tell, like in northern Luzon, diba, there's a lot of. It's very interesting actually. Luzon and Mindanao, ibang-iba siya. So when it comes to Ikat, right, and fiber, so it's really cotton dominant as well as indigo, no, sa northern Luzon. Pero sa Mindanao, I mean, there are certainly linguistic traces of indigo, no. Like some I think Marian Rosas was suggesting kinarem as a word might be coming from tarem or tagum, no, which would be indigo, no. So there might be something there as well. So I don't know, but I find those things kind of intriguing. But thank you. That's a great question.
Yeah, because then that means for me also, if you add to that, let's say no one questions that the back loom, the back strap loom is something that came in from mainland Southeast Asia, right? The technology. And then, so I was just thinking, if we don't see it, any trace of it in the mainland, this kind of textile, then the technology was coming in, but then people were using the, like you said, the most common material, and then from there you have this, the development of all this original kind of cultural expression. So that's fascinating. But then let me then ask you about, I don't know if there's someone else asking, then I'll stop first.
No, I think there's, it's just me, but go ahead, sir.
No, you were critical and right here of the Lacerda et al. Genetic article. Now there's a big issue now, and about the ethics of the work, from the local genetics group, and then our friend Mike Puruganan, I think, and everyone has an issue about the way they got their data and how they didn't get consent. But on top of that, I heard there are other issues too, right? And I like the idea, your critique about how they categorize it. And while we have no other choice, but to categorize them by ethno-linguistic groups at the moment. But that's a cautionary tale that must not be forgotten. What you mentioned, that these ethno-linguistic groups could be very recent, and they change a lot, right? And so that's something that we always remind our population genetic friends when they analyze the patterns that they get out of genetic studies. But your comment about the Buckley paper, and this is also interesting. That's why I asked you earlier about intentionality of transmission. Is could it be that what you've observed is, like you mentioned, wasn't the ideal, right? It wasn't like at the apex of its practice, and so it's so hard to tease out any traditions of passing of transmission of knowledge, etc. But I agree that it doesn't have to be a deliberate transmission of knowledge. And in fact, I agree that, and I bet, as you asked, oh, was this buaya, this alligator? You asked them what is the meaning of and their eyes glaze, or they're bored by that question.
Oh yeah.
Because I think you're right. They are not, for them, it's just, I will say, it's just appropriate that those images are there, but the explanation behind it is totally gone already, or was never there to begin with.
But maybe
Somewhere in the past, perhaps, or someone, an individual or two invented it or introduced it, but the transmission now is more of the form rather than a meaning.
I guess it's an elicitation issue, because you see, when I share this bit of information, well, first I come from art history, and I left art history, and I went into anthropology. But one of the things that art historians, and I know because I was an art historian, and in many cases I still am, is this obsession with motifs. And so, puro buaya, I mean, puno, boat, this kind of like thing. And I understand that the motifs are meaningful, especially when you're trying to trace, for example, right, Indian textiles, and the ship cloths and all that. I understand all that. However, what I've learned from my colleagues who work in Eastern Indonesia, especially, is that similarly, the weavers also think about it in terms of counts. So that's the first. And also that the notion of pattern names is not the way we think about it as pattern names. So they have a name for a pattern, but it's not really a motif. So it's like a kind of a look. So my suggestion is that we might need to reorganize our understanding of how this knowledge is organized by them. So it's an elicitation question. So how do you then get that information? So the way to do it would be to ask them to talk about it the way they wish to talk about it, which in this case, hindi sila interesado. I mean, they were trying to be kind to me, but it was very clear, no? Talagang
They were not
hindi yun, hindi yun ang interest nila. So siyempre, you know, you just say, okay, stop that. Let's just follow their lead,
Yeah.
no?
Yes.
And what do they want to talk about?
But just
And I think it's because the counts are the suggestion of efficacy and status. So
Yeah.
kung kaya mo yung 100, bigatin ka. So
how pero just specific to the counts, could it be just the equivalent of, for example, if you do the rosary, no, and you don't really know anything about the you know, the cosmology, you're not interested in the Judeo-Christian philosophy behind it, and you're just counting it, no? In other words, the lower order the artisans are still like workers in their and therefore they are, and the higher level artisans are the ones who will be setting, you know, telling you, you know, Cheree, you know, the meaning of this is that and that, you know.
Yeah.
Of course, half of it they probably just invented, no, but the counting is something that is part of the rigor of learning, the skill of the weaving and the pattern making. So I mean, I just an idea of what it could be, no?
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's because when they start tying the designs, especially let's say for the Tiboli that do it like both the red and the black, right, occurring in the same case. Habang nagtatay ka kasi, nagko-compose ka na in your head, no? So the narrow counts are easy kasi they're just like parang fillers, no? But the counts that are wider are the ones that actually begin to have imagery, no? So
Sure.
So palm fronds, frog, no? You know, of course, lizard, why? And also you have all of those things. And then some that don't have recognizable names, right? But they have pattern names, no?
Mhm.
So pag nagtatay ka na, in a sense, nagko-compose ka na in your head, no? And so that's actually very hard, no? Kasi, now they do use copies. So for example, Salinta had kept her mother's mother piece, no, as a pattern, no? So you could actually look and copy, which is done all over Southeast Asia. So you would have weavers that would actually keep them, no, parang as a pattern. But then the really, really good ones can compose patterns in their heads that never existed before, although it's rare. No, it's rare. It's quite rare. But I guess that's why the count is part of the way they kind of talk about, you know, the greatness of a weaver. No?
Yeah.
Kasi it's the ability to be able to compose, no, in this kind of parang kaya kong symphony, you know? Hindi lang song, I can do symphony. You know? So that's I think what's being suggested by the discussion of counts.
Yeah, and there was an interesting comment here in the chat by Ma'am Aya. He said Dr. Quizon's remarks about motifs and going for a look resonates with her experiences with tattooing. So yeah, it seems like a very interesting connection you might be able to make between those two.
Yeah, because there's certainly, although I must say that tattooing, perhaps from a technical standpoint, might allow for a little bit more innovation, right, than let's say Ikat, no? Kasi Ikat is more kind of rigid, no? Kailangan, it has to be certain things. But yes, I agree that there's a certain inherent creativity to it that's very satisfying to the weavers. Buckley actually, his stuff on the Ikat patterning itself, interestingly, he associates, looking at all that data he did, because he was doing, I think, Monte Carlo modeling or something. So he said that Mindanao, based on what he was looking at, was closest to, he said, Iban, no? Northern Borneo, which is, I thought, very interesting.
Yeah.
Hiniwalay na yung ulap doyo. So again, I'm kind of going back and looking at it more closely, but I thought that was an interesting kind of. And then sadly, he couldn't use any data from Northern Luzon. So I'm thinking, can we do something about that? So maybe the Northern Luzon data can be kind of organized in such a way that it could be used, right, for those types of, modeling.
Sorry. I have a question that before I left my internet left or went away. When I may not have may mga na-miss siguro ako na tungkol sa motive. Because when we talk about this is of course based on the weaver's perspective. May malaking chunk ako nawala sa conversation. Pero when we talk about the weaving counts, we're talking about the weavers or the people who are making the cloth. But when we talk about motifs, baka ako lang, pero we're talking also about the people who are going to use the cloth. So it may be the people who are going to use the cloth are not the ones who are weaving them. So baka that's why when we talk about motif with the weavers, it's not important to them, but it may be important. That's why there's a difference in the transmission of the information rin, but in a horizontal way, I guess. I don't know if it's.
What do you mean by horizontal?
Sorry, it's a visual in my brain, but it's not. So it's for the intended users. Or yes. For the future users rin siguro, pero who are. I remember. I don't know if it was in your work or someone else's, that when the weavers when they make the weavers are also part of choosing who are the people who will be wearing their works.
Yes.
So pag mataas na yung rank nila, yeah. Yeah. So
in the late 20th century, I saw that much of, at least for the Bagobo, to get new cloth, especially the high status Abaca Ikat cloth, you need to basically commission it. So kasi mahal siya. So essentially you basically decide you want to do it, and you basically kind of commission it, unless of course meron kang kamag-anak who is a weaver who will then make it and give it to you. So I have informants who were gifted their garments by their mothers, for example, ginawa nung nanay nila for them. But for new ones, they would commission it, and they doesn't necessarily have to be Abaca Ikat. I've also noticed that in the kind of the arc of Bagobo textiles from the late 19th to the late 20th century, there's a great deal of innovation with upper garments and a great deal of conservatism for lower garments. So this might tie back into Jack's question about washing. So the upper garments nowadays are basically made of whatever, cotton, polyester. So I think you saw that in that slide I showed. So they're whatever they can find it, and it's very, very different. And even in the early 20th century, there was a lot of innovation with upper garments. Even back then, they would actually buy shop-bought cotton, for example, and use them for upper garments. But for lower garments, less so. And this is very, very interesting. And so the lower garments also don't need to get washed, right? Because it's, Abaca doesn't stick to your body. It's iba siya, so iba yung feeling niya on the body. However, it has to be polished for the Bagobo, because otherwise it's not beautiful. But yes, because it's based on commission in most cases, which would be rare, then those types of conversations can come in. However, it's not to the point that you would say, gusto ko may buhaya, gusto ko you cannot commission it that way. What you can ask for would be, a high status cloth. And then the weaver will ganong kind. Kasi usually they would say, kung ayaw nilang gawin, they'll say, ay, masakit ng katawan ko, matanda na ako. So it's a long negotiation process. If they don't want to make it for you, they'll all do all kinds of reasons. And some of that would be what I mentioned in that article, wherein if they don't think you're worthy, they're not going to make it for you. So this really interesting dimension also of wheedling, to kind of get them to make something for you. This is for Abaca Ikat. Now the other types of cloth that all over Mindanao are being used, such as especially garments, those just require somebody who can buy cloth and have a sewing machine. So pwede mong gawin, I think, in many different ways. Pero mas mahirap makuha yung Abaca for that purpose. In fact, there has been substitution wherein I know of a woman who used mandaya cloth, that the closest she could come to a bagobo look, no, polished it, which mandaya don't polish, polished it and used it as a skirt for herself and for her daughter. Kasi wala siyang mapupang bagobo, for example, no. So sa kanya, that's an acceptable substitution. So I hope that answers the question about, this relationship between owners and users. For sure, as ethnographic populations, they're distinct. No? So the makers and then the owners or users of the cloth, and the ones who don't own them anymore but know, right, the cloth itself and the varieties and their importance, they're actually distinct populations, no? That occur within the same community.
All right. Thank you so
Right.
much for that. There's another question, JJ.
Yes, actually, I might have missed a question earlier because I think it was sent around the same time as Aya's question, but it's actually from Pao. And she asked, speaking of threads, is there any information on the manufacture and use of threads as string materials by any chance? For example, like using the thread as a string for necklaces.
I'm assuming it's about banana fiber, right? Musa thread, right? That's what I'm assuming the question is
Yes,
about.
I would assume as well.
So yes, Abaca is widely used for all kinds of things. In fact, I reread some of the stuff I have on Ikat in Indonesia. So it's reported to be used in Bali, for example, to do the tying for the Ikat. No, so it's not for the thread itself, but they use it for the tying of the bundles. Excuse me, in Bali, and I think also in East Timor and Eastern Indonesia. But it's also used in everything, basketry, right? I think it was an export product to make women's hats in Europe, no? So, so for using to string a necklace, definitely, right? You would still see that today, right? In many cases. So it, as a fiber, it's got very wide economic use and wide economic importance. And in fact, it still is kind of grown by many smallholders all over Mindanao. They bring it to the market kinikilo, no, you sell it by the kilo. And then they're all rated by first class, second class, third class. So some are good for rope, some are good for various things. Most of it is exported by the Philippines, I think, to make security paper. No, so it's a major export product also coming from let's say Bicol region and that size. Somebody who also works on the Pulahan in Samar told me that part of the Pulahan uprising was also some kind of disruption in Abaca crop production. No? So it's got this interesting kind of branches. So it's everywhere. No? So definitely it's very versatile. No? And it's widespread, certainly sa Pilipinas. I think we tend to take it for granted that. But outside of the Philippines, it's harder to find in the way it's used here. No, used in Philippines. I hope that answers the question concerning the thread itself. Yes, I hope.
I think so. Yeah, if you have more, yeah, she says thank you. Great.
Okay.
Right, yeah. So I think there's another question by Felicidad Prudente, and he asks, do the Bagobo dream their designs or patterns?
Yes, but not everybody will tell you that they dream it. So Salinda Manon, who I worked with, is a very she's a curmudgeon. So she doesn't want to go into poetic fancy. In fact, she's distrustful of it. So she was my principal informant. However, another Bagobo woman I met in the Sibulan area, as well as Languder, herself also talk about dreams, yes. But Buckley points this out. There is really a limited number of possible motifs with Ikat, with warp Ikat. So one could dream them, but they still kind of follow a convention. So the dreams would be sources of inspiration. For sure, the poetry and the mythology, right, talks about the beauty of cloth and of the and so the mythological figures, as well as the worthiness of the wearer. So there's a lot of poetic content. But the dreaming, I found it's claimed by some, but not others. but I believe that it's a metaphor for creativity, no? So so when Langdulay tells me this is a motif I made because I dreamed it, right? And she showed it to me, for example, right? And so I believe her, right? But this is kind of like a new, innovative kind of design that she came up with. But in truth, right, there's like a limited number of possible Ikat designs if you could actually kind of model it. But yes, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, it's interesting because sorry, I just wanted to say that because it's interesting regarding the sources of the mga yung inspiration nila for making the motifs, but it's also based on their, I guess, their surroundings as well. But the concept that it's also limited based on the possible.
Highly conventionalized, yes. It's
Yeah.
conventional.
Yeah. So I think na as people now who are also looking at motifs, or in patterns, then it's also important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, my art historical training was useful in this sense, no? Kasi it's like saying, okay, you're gonna be an oil painter. You're limited when you do oil on canvas, no? The oil on canvas only allows you this much, no?
Yeah.
So ganun siya, no? So use ganun your fiber and abaca and then when you say, okay, I'm going to be using kind of like, if I'm gonna be doing oil paints, what is possible with oil paints? So ganun din siya. Conventions also define, you know, kind of like you might say the palette. No, it defines a lot of things about what you seek to achieve. No, so what's interesting with what some of the newer things that they did would be, I saw some examples wherein Bagobo weavers actually used commercial thread and commercial dye because it was commissioned by, you know, by fellow Bagobo. Kasi gusto nila malahban at saka maplansya, no? They wanted something, they used DNC thread. And it was fascinating because it was pink, it was green, you know, and they had these examples. And then there were some examples too where they used commercial dye, pinks and greens on Abaca to try to kind of see what they can do, no? So for those examples, the motifs, the Ikat motifs are identical. Yung kulay lang ang nagbago, no? So ginamit nila yung same Ikat vocabulary nila, pero iba yung fiber, iba yung kulay, no? Pero kita mo siya, so biglang sabi ko, may baby pink, may baby blue, no? Because they were trying to kind of, you know, innovate, no? But so those examples I've seen, no, pareho yung design, no? Nagbago yung kulay, tsaka nagbago yung thread. So it's kind of like that. In that sense, you know, that notion of what is possible within your kind of visual vocabulary.
Yes,
it's important.
I still have questions regarding the concept of innovation, but there are other questions. And then the next, this was a direct message to me from Aya Ragragio, which is a question from Myfel, because they're together. So, hi, Cheree, notwithstanding your informant's disinterest in the matter, are there durable patterns or motifs that are unambiguously observable in the Tagabawa and Giangan Ikat?
Yes. Yes. So kasi syempre I kind of persisted as well. So some of them, they could not tell me why that name is that name. So clearly it's a convention, no? So one of them is pakpakasalimao. I still have, you know, hindi nila ma-explain sa ano yung pakpakasalimao, but it's an Ikat motif that I've actually also seen in Blaan textile, for example. So the Blaan, for the Blaan, and then the Tibolio also have, no? So but they have different names. So you have this kind of specific kind of motifs. Buaya, of course, is everywhere because I guess it makes sense. It's the apex predator, no, of Mindanao, no? So the buaya is everywhere. And they're quite recognizable, right, where they are. And then there would be this fringe motifs that it's been explained to me is the leaves of the palm from where the loom lumber is derived from. No, so you have, so what you find is that these specific elements are actually found everywhere. No, they're repeated. Ang kakaiba lang talaga, which is really why I find the Mandaya very interesting. No? The Mandaya are kind of distinct. No, so the Mandaya, you would probably I think I showed it to you in that image. No, meron sila yung human figures. No, that usually are in the central panel of cloth. No? Which was observed in the early 20th century, but I no longer observe it. Not today. Laura Watson Benedict collected a piece in Davao del Sur that had human figures, no? Similar to some of the things you would find also in Iban, no? But I don't see them anymore. But yes, the answer is certain patterns repeat. And then they have a lot of the filler patterns, no? Yung mga, they call it bolet, no? Or they call it funly, which is like rice grains. So you have all these kind of whimsical terms, which is why I guess when I say that they're disinterested, I guess, I mean that the terms that you would find for some of them are rather whimsical, which is similar to the Iban case, wherein they're not really mapped onto the actual image the way we call it, no? But they're kind of like, yeah, pwede yung rice grains kasi mukha siyang rice grain, no? Pero pwede rin siyang tubig kasi mukha siyang tubig. No? So you have this kind of whimsical way, wherein I think in the Iban case they call it like meta names, no? So they're not names of the pattern itself, but they're meta names. But yes, if you just kind of remove the naming and just look at the motif, umuulit siya, makikita mo siya it appears in different groups. The Tiboli have a very interesting compositional approach that I don't find in some of the other groups. And I think it's because, I didn't talk about this in my presentation, but it's important. When we think about textiles in the Philippines, not just in Mindanao, we have to kind of distinguish between garments and flats. So flats are blankets. So flats or blankets are meant for, right? Diba, sinasabit mo for, like in Northern Luzon, diba, funeral blankets, for example, for display. In Tiboli, it would be like these kind of ritual space definers, no, for marriages, whereas garments are made to be worn. No? So the Tiboli make these very large blankets, yekumo, no, mother, they call it the mother blanket. And because of that, the compositional requirements of a very large blanket made for display, which would be like sometimes 2 meters wide, no? or wider in some cases, no? Very large scale cloths, have a different kind of demand, no? Design-wise. And so, so the designs that you would find with the Tiboli, for example, tend to be different than, let's say, you would find with the Bagobo and the Bland.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very interesting thing. And then, yeah, I think we have another. Yeah, we have another question here from Marie Andre Palon, and she asked, "Is there a commonality of design here in Southeast Asia? And can you expand more on this?"
When you say design, I'm just going to approach it as design that's consistent with warp ikat. So the technique would be putting ikat on the warp. The warp threads is the vertical, no? And the horizontal would be the weft. No? So when it comes to warp ikat, whether you're looking at Southeast Asia or even Central Asia, there are similarities when you look at it because of the nature of warp ikat. No? It's got this fuzzy, di ba? Parang kasi ikat is parang nag-fade pages at tabi, no? So there's also ikat, of course, in India, no? So ikat is very widespread. So the technique itself has this certain look that makes it kind of distinctive because you know that it's already ikat. In other parts of the world, you have weft ikat. So you have this in Bali, as well as double ikat. So you have this also in Indonesia. And so for the question of, in what sense do you see similarities, let's say, with Southeast Asia for that question? I would say that the strong affinities would be color. No? So red and black, that's very, very kind of striking. No? You have to omit Bali in this case. No? It really has to be Eastern Indonesia, no? As well as Borneo, Kalimantan. It's this kind of palette that you find. So warp ikat na, tapos you have that specific palette. Then when you start looking at the compositions of the textiles itself, because it's a warp ikat, so they would have the ikat here, then they would have kind of side, parang bars na hindi masyadong ikat. So then you have this kind of things that I would say the technique demands. No, so the technique demands it. So they would have certain similarities in compositional approaches. No, but yes, but as far as that is concerned, now if you want to ask me about specific motifs that occur, then that's going to be a harder kind of thing to push for. You're not going to find it. So, for example, is there an equal obsession with crocodiles outside of Mindanao? Not so much, no, which is interesting because they have crocodiles there too, no? So not so much. And then, of course, there's certain things that occur in other areas that won't be in the Philippines. So in other parts of Southeast Asia, they have horses, no, right? And another was that they have imports from India, they have elephants, for example, right? In other parts of Indonesia, for example, they have what they call ship cloths. So they have the ships themselves, not that appear. So I don't necessarily see them, right, in our case. But if you know, in general, kind of like affinities, a lot, which is kind of like why my work is always kind of tied in with Southeast Asia, because they look so similar, right? The Mindanaoikas look so similar. But I always have to make the point, they look so similar, but they're made so differently. No, and that's what I'm trying to kind of point out here. You know, so what does it mean, you know, when they're made so differently? What can we kind of learn about that? No? But yes, it's unmistakable. No? Kaya I'm so interested in everything in Eastern Indonesia. I read everything I can about it because I believe that there's a lot going on there. That there's some overlap.
Sorry, I think that's a great way of looking at it, because you're breaking it down not just in the motifs, but it's also in the people who the making of it, and it's so you're not just looking at the design, it's also looking at the techniques that is available for the canvas, for the cloth. So and then also the concepts of how it can be worn, so or how it's used when it's worn. So there's also that added notion rin na I'm very interested sa concept na it's actual, they're garments, so they're made to be they have to be worn, so that's that added thing. And maganda, interesting yung question ni Jack earlier when he asked about the washing na, no, because it's worn, it's something that we also have to think about. This is an everyday material. So I really like that. I think because it's almost 2, we can ask one last question, which Dr. Paz might be.
Cheree, you were mentioning, when you mentioned it again in that last answer, the you've established that red has a higher status or ranking than black. Did your informants or your observation, do you have an answer? Do they have an answer for that? Why is red higher than black from their standpoint? No?
Part of the answer was because, well, you know, when you're doing ethnographic field work, no, to ask those kinds of questions require a great deal of comfort on both you and your informant. So you can only ask these highly demanding, intrusive questions very late in your relationship, no, with the weaver. So when I had these types of conversations, no, with Salinta, ang sagot niya, kasi Salinta is the pragmatist, no, mas mahirap yung pula. No? So that's kind of like it's the one that sabi niya, it needs more work, no, in Cebuano mag-imo, no, and also it needs more knowledge, no. So yun ang sagot niya, na mahirap yung pula. Pag kinausap ko mga lalaki, sabi nila bloodshed. So ang sagot nila kasi, di ba, maraming pinatay, therefore that was, so, and I'm kind of skeptical, I guess, because you know, in most cases, right, there is this greater interest, right, in kind of this depiction, right. However, it is consistent, right, with the literature elsewhere in Southeast Asia, no, that there is an association with this is something that's very common in Indonesian literature and not so much in the Philippines, Kasi I guess they have more of the Dutch anthropology and we had American anthropology, you know. But the notion that Traudy Gavin made this observation about even that textiles are the women's warpath. No? So if men take heads, then the women make cloth, no? And in fact, with the Pagobo, they say that the most senior weavers were the ones that who had the privilege of welcoming the returning warriors, no, by being able to greet them. So there is this kind of association, right, with blood, no. But I make that, I get to that point in this roundabout way. From the women themselves, they don't necessarily say this, no. But the men will say it all the
I like
time.
how you are treating it, because like you, for me, the meaning is transient, and it changes. It changes per agent, per generation, per culture, per, you know, and therefore, while they're not there, they might have been true, right? That warpath thing. It might have been an articulation of a very articulate informant, and your informant was also right. Oh, well, it's hard to, you know, that's good enough. But one thing is for sure, red is higher than black. So for me, that is
Mindanao. Yeah.
sa Mindanao, no? Where red is higher than black, and that is what is across the board accepted, and the meaning will be different almost all the time. That's how I see things now, with all of these motifs. So it's just appropriate that red.
Yeah, I was trying to kind of build on that and make a larger case for red cloth that presumably is Abaca cloth elsewhere all over the Philippines. That was kind of like what I was trying to do with my bloody reds paper, looking at the Pulahan. And I was told that indeed they had, although not in the historical time, but prior to that, they have this kind of red headcloths now in Samar Leyte. That was made of Abaca. So I think that's interesting. I'm going to look a little bit more into that. No, but then that only works because of this whole Morinda, right? Morinda versus Dioscorus Metida thing. Once indigo comes in, which would be right in Luzon, I don't know how that maps, no, because it would be a different kind of environment, ecological kind of givens, no. But yes, I tend to be skeptical of. I guess, yeah, I tend to be skeptical of the overemphasis on, I guess I don't want to mystify. Siguro, you know, I try not to mystify because I think mystification can be fun, but we have to bracket it. I'm mystifying now. but when we're looking at how the cloth is made and how people think about making the cloth, I think it's important for us to kind of always present it as a knowledge system. No? So it's actually an ecosystem that has kind of knowledge. It's passed down, it's organized, no, it's repeatable, it's patterned. No? So it's really a knowledge system. And within that knowledge system, no, textiles kind of operate, no, within this whole system of action.
Thank you for that answer. I think that's a very good way of putting that all together, and it's a timely reminder for all of us archaeologists as well. There are a lot of students who are also listening, but they're very shy because they're not asking questions or they're conversing with me at the background in direct messages. So, and I think it would be nice if you would, for everyone who is listening, you can also contact Dr. Cheree for more questions.
Yeah,
about this, because it's a nice way of putting together all of the different materials. There's and looking at as you mentioned, an ecosystem. So you have the plants, the people who are gathering it, who are preparing it, the people who are making the cloth, the people who are wearing the clothes, and eventually when it gets passed down to or given to different people or to museums, there's also a different meaning that can be approached through that. And I think that's one of the things that I guess one of the last questions that I will also ask based on the on what you were discussing. Are you now moving towards comparing this into garments in Indonesia. Is that what I'm understanding? Or
Well, I always look at what's in Indonesia, no, which is why the IBAN is really interesting to me, because the IBAN is I think the one that's most relevant, no. However, for me to compare it, I could make a comparison just by making the observations about light patterns and similarities, no. But unless I have more, I don't have, you know, I don't really want to jump and say, oh, you know, diffusion, you know, because that's the that's something that I think I should guard against, no. What I am looking at is actually not necessarily textiles per se, but modeling of how to understand identity. So that latter part of my talk concerning ethnolinguistics, right, and the notion of a Bagobo identity, that's really what's kind of really in the forefront of my thinking right now. And so I'm revisiting work I wrote in the past, and I'm rereading, for example, Jim Warren's Sulu zone, right? This notion of a zone, right? Maria Mangas talking about landscape, and also so this notion of a polyethnic zone as actually default, no? Polyethnic zones as being kind of normative. And I'm then looking at also mainland Southeast Asia, this notion of zomia, no? So the periphery, no? People in the peripheries, because I'm thinking that this is because of the what my work, no, kahit na Bagobo, if you know, focus ko, nakikita ko all these kind of resonances, no, with all the groups all over, no, in the patterns, na Mandaya is this way, Bla and people this way, so that's kind of leading me to think about it really as a, you know, which is where we need to move, actually, to move away from this notion of one tribe, one style, right? This notion of one group of people, one kind of material culture. It's just not going to work, no. So instead, I'm trying to think of this textile production occurring in a polyethnic space as a default, no. I say it is really the case in Mindanao, no? Actually all over the Philippines, no. It's essentially multilingual, where, right? It's like most of the textiles that I showed you, and some of them can actually be linked back, for example, to India, for example, no? But then you don't necessarily have to say that Indian imports came in. It was really because weavers innovate and they see this and they copy, for example. No? But when they copy, they make it their own. So this kind of stuff that's going on all the time. And so that's what I'm kind of looking at. I'm looking at how textile production, you know, the dressed body, no, essentially become part of this polyethnic space, no, and so it's really theory I'm looking at. So not so much the cloth, but the theory. But you see, Indonesia will always be close to my heart because of the affinities, no, especially for Eastern Indonesia, definitely, no, it's certainly there. But at most, I've done it before. I kind of compared Mindanao stuff to the IBAN stuff, and I might go back to that. Yeah, yun ang intriguing sa akin. Borneo, Kalimantan.
great. I think that's a very good idea, Ren. And I wanted to. Jack said bagus, and I also think that, well, for me, I was also excited about this because of the concepts na the cloth in, or the concepts of dressing people, and syempre it's just at the back of our minds. Yung maitum jars also have their clothes, not necessarily clothes, but there's a pottery. They were ginawan sila ng bangles, meron silang mga mukhang possible clothing, so it's one of the things that can be looked at, but that's very way off na sa conversation, but it's still the representation. Yes.
What's interesting, when I was asked to give a talk at the Asia Society for the gold exhibit, there was actually a piece in the gold exhibit that I took one look at it and I go, oh my God, that's part of a Bagobo trouser. You know, but this is the Surigao gold, and also, so of course it's disturbed site, so it's got all kinds of problems with it. No, however, that those gold ornaments that I saw was consistent with the kind of removable um, um, men's trouser cuff that the Bagobo make today. I took one look and I go, yun nga yun. That's actually one of these cuffs that go, the short trouser and parang short pants, parang, but except it's made of gold. So sabi ko, what do I make of it? This is what I make of it, no? Now, I don't know what we say about time depth, because for that particular kind of, formation, the Bagobo trouser, that as far as I know, I'm very conservative, so I'm not gonna say that it exists before 1880 because I don't know if it exists before 1880. It might, maybe 1850, but I can't move it beyond that. So I don't know what we can say about that. However, the form factor is very striking. It's consistent with that kind of garment, no, kahit na gold siya. So there are things that we can say, I think, about the red. I think you told me about the red slips, no, on the pottery, the maitong pottery, no. Na damit ba yon, no, yung pula? Posibleng damit yon, no, or it's an expression of being garbed in red, no. It's certainly a very valuable and very kind of and very striking and still very compelling kind of textile, no. The all red. They have an all red na walang ikat, no. That's a very, very special kind, no? Kasi ang hirap gawin nun eh, no? To make an all red cloth actually be beautiful red deep, and then as Jack would say, pag nilaban mo hindi dapat mag-fade para pag natubigan yung so there's certainly something to be said about such stunning garments, no? So yeah, it's hard to tell, pero kung may bangles sila, no, at kung then that's probably supposed to be a suggestion of garments. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case.
Something for everyone to think about.
Speculative.
And there's sabi ni Aya, sorry, no, they're tattoos, charot. Pero, but it's a nice thing because we're even if people are looking at a particular material or a particular method only, by conversing and looking at other people's works based on other materials as well, then we can see connections then, and we can also say a lot of things about more importantly, I think it's because it's recent, the people who are wearing this, we can still converse with them. They can tell us more about their choices and why they are choosing to make a particular cloth this way or a particular garment this way. Why are they wearing these garments this way? So all of those things, we can try to collect them and then try to see if there are patterns that we can put sa past. So thank you for that talk, Dr. Cheree. That was a very great talk, and thank you for accommodating us at this very late hour. There, it's just turned 2 a.m. there, I think. So
Yes.
thank you so much. And
Cheree, thank you very much.
thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure. At yeah, just contact me. Alam ko, may binanggit si Kate, gusto daw niya ng collaboration. I mean, I'm looking for collaborators, but sana naman maayos na yung COVID situation. But yeah, more. Oh, there. Hi, Kate. So, but yes, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah, salamat. It's a pleasure to meet everybody at sana magkita tayo ng face-to-face balang araw. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good night na from here.
Thank you.
Good morning na pala.
Thank you. For next week, our speaker will be Kevin Laksamana, who will talk about trans workers in Southeast Asia. So we will go back at 1 p.m. For our talks. But everyone else, thank you. And thank you to people who attended, who are also taking time outside of their time zones and accommodating us.